All right, everybody, I'm going to try to get into Daryl Dixon episode 2. And when I say try, it's because holy cow, there is a lot to unpack here. There's just a lot to talk about. Like, I couldn't believe the volume of stuff in this episode. Even in terms of storylines, I counted like 6 separate storylines. And yeah, some of them are part of bigger storylines. You could kind of group them together, but there's just a lot going on. That said, I thought the episode was brilliant. It watches very well, very smoothly, even though it's jumping back and forth a lot. I don't have a problem watching it. It was really, really good. So I'm just going to jump in. I'm going to talk about one storyline at a time so that I'm not going back and forth because I think that will get confusing. First of all, let's acknowledge the title. It's called Alouette, which is a French song about a bird. Now, we've seen a lot of bird symbolism, especially things that remind us of Beth. So I think that's intentional. It's also very important that this is yet another episode that's named after a song. The songbird on the show was always Beth. She was always the one who was singing, and that's important. The way that the song is showcased in the episode is that it was something that was calming during difficult times. So Isabelle and her sister Lily talked about how their mom used to sing it to them to calm them down, which was sweet. The song itself is a very well-known French song. I took French a million years ago back in junior high, and we actually learned the song, so I was familiar with it. And I was told that it was a French drinking song. I don't know if that's at all what they're going for in the show, but if that is something that it's well known for in France, then that's also an alcohol reference, But it's about petting a bird, and it's a simple song, very repetitive. Children could sing it. So that's what it's called, and it's really interesting. Let me next just go through quickly what the plot lines I identified were. First of all, we have the plot that's going on in the present day, which is Daryl, Isabelle, Laurent, and Sylvie. Then we have the plot that goes on at the preschool with the gal who, tell me you didn't get Beth vibes from her, who runs the preschool. Of course, there's Isabelle's backstory, which is Laurent's birth and his origins. There's the mule's death, which is kind of its own thing outside the narrative and is really interesting. There's Cordon following them, which doesn't come until the very, very end, but there is that. And then there's the American guy that they find in the castle. And yes, that actually is part of the preschool story. So you could actually count those together and say that there are 5, but in a lot of ways, that's also kind of its own thing. I'll explain why when I get to it. So you could actually say there's like 6 different plot lines going on here. So it's complicated, but it's all related and it's fabulous. Okay, so I'm going to go through these one at a time. Like I said, I'm going to start with the present day, which is just about Isabelle, Daryl, and Laurent. So of course, all of the stories are intertwined. For this, I'm just going to talk about a few specific things that are not the preschool, because the preschool is its own thing. So at the beginning, the first thing that we see is Daryl and Isabelle looking at a map. They are trying to get north, and Daryl wants to go directly to Paris, but Isabelle wants to go somewhere else first. And Daryl doesn't like that because it's going to take longer. But she says that this person they're going to see specifically has a radio, and therefore that's where they need to go first. I'm not really sure what to read into that yet, but I think it's very significant that they told us that. And of course, we've seen a lot of really important maps, so it's important that they're looking at the map, that they're going over the route, all of that. Then we have Laurent asking questions, kind of funny questions about death, and Daryl gets after him. And basically, Daryl's getting after him for talking too much. And that's interesting. Now, overall, I do think that Laurent is mostly a parallel to Daryl, but he's a mixture of things for sure. And this actually, especially as we get into what happens to their mule, this feels like a parallel to Beth. Because Laurent is talking a lot and it annoys Daryl, and we kind of had that vibe in Still, that she was just talking and he was not, and he was annoyed by her singing and that sort of thing. It kind of felt like a parallel or a callback to that. So then we get into what happens to the mule. Now, first of all, you should know that the mule's name is Asterix, and you can look that up. I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail, but it is a famous French story, The Adventures of Asterix, set during Julius Caesar's time. He's a warrior who has all these adventures. So it's probably a story that would have been told to Laurent, because I guess it's pretty prevalent in French culture. It's also a comic book, which makes it, in a lot of ways, almost like a French parallel to the Walking Dead comics, which I think is kind of fun. So that was what the mule's name was, and Laurent loves this mule. because he won't go forward. I think it's interesting that they specifically talk about how stubborn the mule is. And of course, mules are known to be stubborn. But I remember back when Still and Alone were happening, Lauren Cohen saying that about Beth's character, that she really has a strong will. And that felt like a little bit of a parallel as well, saying that she's strong. So just remember that as we get into Asterix's story here. Because the mule would not go forward, and clearly it's because it sensed walkers being there, Daryl knew it was going to get eaten if he didn't release it. So he let it go, and then he fired off a gun, and the mule runs away, and it does get away from the walkers at that point, right? So before we move forward with the story in the present day, let's just stay on Asterix's story. We don't really see what happens to him then, but later Laurent finds him in the woods, and he unfortunately has been eaten by the walkers and is dead. Now, the first thing this is a huge callback to is Buttons in season 5. Daryl tried to save him, but then he ended up getting killed. And Buttons, back when that happened, we knew that that was a huge parallel to Beth because of what Daryl said about the mule when he was, about the horse, Buttons. When he was approaching it, he said, "You used to belong to someone, now you're just yours." And that was clearly Daryl talking about himself and belonging, at least emotionally, to Beth before he lost her. So this is another callback to that, and I think it's very similar. It's the same thing. But go with me, because looking at everything that happened before the mule was killed actually shows even more strongly that it's a parallel to what happened with Beth. Number one, when we first see the mule in the first scene, Laurent is feeding it green apples. Okay, so we're told later that the mule likes apples. That's his favorite treat. But they're green apples. At Grady, Beth had a green apple sucker, right? Or lollipop. Then there's the part where the mule is released. Daryl actually fires off a gun and the mule runs away, right? So to me, that is a callback to Beth being shot at Grady, the gunshot. And then Beth disappeared from the narrative, just like the mule disappeared from the narrative, right? And then later, it's found to be dead. Now, don't let that worry you. I know there's some of you that are probably thinking this shows that Beth really is dead. But number one, there should at least be a question mark there, because it's not like after Beth got shot, we ever saw what happened to her. We did not see Daryl find her dead in the woods, right? So there's something weird going on there if this is a parallel to her story. The other thing, though, is that I'm looking at this as two possibilities here. Either it's something that happened during the missing 17 days, and no, I don't believe they found her dead for sure during the missing 17 days or anything like that. I think they might have seen something that convinced them she was dead. There's a reason why Daryl didn't ever question it. Something must have happened that absolutely convinced him that she was gone, right? So it could be, referring to something we haven't seen before, because those missing 17 days have still never been shown to us. The other thing is that it really could just be about Grady, okay? Because he was looking for Buttons the horse, and when he found him, he watched Buttons go down right in front of him. And that's very similar to what happened with Beth at Grady. He was looking for her. He couldn't find her after she got taken. And then when he found her, she went down right in front of him. So it could just be representative of her being shot and him assuming that she's dead. As soon as he found the thing he was looking for, it was dead. And the same thing happens with Laurent and the mule. Another reason why I think Laurent is very much a proxy for Daryl here. When Daryl pulls out the gun and is going to let the mule go, Isabel says, "No, don't." I think she thought he was going to shoot the mule. And she said, Laurent loves him. Daryl loved Beth. You know what I mean? It's just, you can see the ties there straight across the board. So Laurent was sad because his mule that he loved died, and Daryl was sad because in his eyes, Beth died and he loved her. Okay, so that's a really important story. It's a really important callback, and they're using it as a proxy. They're trying to remind us of these things. Okay, so back to the present day with Daryl and Isabel and Laurent. I'm going to talk in more detail about the school, since it is very much its own thing and is very important. Lots of juicy details and hints here. But for now, suffice it to say, they left their wagon, they're walking along, and they get kind of attacked by these kids who then take them back to the school. Once they get inside, they realize that these are actually good people. It actually had very much a similar vibe to the Vatos gang from season 1 that they found in the city. There was even a bicycle outside. So it was just, a group of people that originally they thought was a threat, and they seemed very dangerous. And then as it turns out, they're actually good people just trying to survive. I thought this part was really adorable. There are all these kids hanging on Daryl who obviously like him, and it was just really, really sweet. They end up having dinner with them. I have to say, I loved Daryl's prayer. It was just so Daryl. It cracked me up. But it was really also very lovely. And then we see him slurping the soup, which was a very Beauty and the Beast, Disney's Beauty and the Beast thing to do. But then you see all the kids laugh and then mimic him, which was just funny and sweet. Okay, then we get to the Mork and Mindy scene, which was probably my favorite scene of the entire episode. And followed by the one after it, actually, kind of coupled together. So they're watching Mork and Mindy. I'm not terribly familiar with Mork and Mindy. I know what it is, but I've never actually watched an episode of it. It's an old show. And here's the thing, and this is actually a theory put forth by W.D. Way. It's very similar to in season 8, Dwight watching Who's the Boss. Now, Who's the Boss I was much more familiar with because I watched that all the time when I was a kid. But the point is, it's about two unlikely people who come together who couldn't be more different and end up having a romance. In Who's the Boss, there was actually a class distinction. The woman made way more money than he did. He was her housekeeper, but they end up falling in love and having a romance. It's very similar with Mork and Mindy. In this case, Mork is actually an alien, and that's a very strong actual parallel to Daryl right now, because it makes me think of the line from the Bible. I believe it's Moses who says he's a stranger in a strange land. And that's what Daryl is right now. He's a stranger in France. He's completely out of his element. And this is not his country of origin. Well, it's the same thing in Mork and Mindy. This guy's an alien who actually comes to Earth, right? So you couldn't be more of a stranger in a strange land than that. He meets Mindy. They couldn't be more different, but they end up having a romance and even end up having a child together. Okay, so we're seeing these old TV shows, and I think they use the old ones because, for copyright reasons, they're just the easiest ones to get permission to use. But they're very strategic in the way that they are choosing them, okay? The other thing I noticed, I tried to look up the episode they're watching, and Mork and Mindy is so old and it's not super popular anymore, so I don't think it's well indexed in Google. I tried to look up orange dress episode because that's what she's wearing, and he's making a big deal about the dress she's wearing. It's clearly like a very lovely, feminine, not exactly evening gown, but it's not casual wear either. It did look like other people had Googled that before, but I also still couldn't find the exact episode, and maybe it doesn't really matter. But the thing that I noticed is the woman, Mindy, is in this orange dress, and it's an off-the-shoulder dress. And what that made me think of, if this was a purposeful parallel, is that in 401, when we get the Bethel hug, Beth's sweater falls off her shoulder so that her shoulder is exposed. And in this, Mindy is wearing a dress that is cut that way so that her shoulder is exposed. I thought that was interesting. So while they're watching this, at first, Daryl's laughing. And, I watched this actually twice before I started doing these videos. And he does actually say, "Hey, no way." And that's because he later tells Isabel that this was actually a show he watched with Merle. So it would be like if we were in the apocalypse and somebody turned on The Walking Dead or something, that's actually something we watched and really liked. And so that's kind of the experience he's having, and he's laughing and having a good time with the kids. And then we just see his face drop. There's no doubt in my mind that this was about romance. And actually that gets very reinforced in the next scene. Okay. And I don't see how he could be thinking about anything else except the fact that this is a romance and he doesn't have that. And all these kids, he never had kids of his own. And again, this is something that we constantly hear. A lot of people were pointing out to me that in the first episode, Laurent specifically asked Daryl if he had a wife or if he had kids. Now, that's not only very on the nose, but it's a foreshadow. Okay, they wouldn't be saying that if it weren't going to happen for Daryl at some point, and this is clearly something that he wants. In this episode, episode 2, at one point when he's getting after Isabel for not telling the truth to Laurent, she says, "You don't have kids, do you?" And she's just talking about being protective of your children, but again, they're pointing that out. And then he meets all these kids who are orphans, and a lot of them are grabbing his hands and his arms and hugging him and hanging on him, and he's just smiling. It's sweet and it's sad because it's just something that he clearly wants. And as he's watching Mork and Mindy, which is about a romance, he suddenly stops smiling as though it makes him sad. Now, of course, certain ships and certain shippers are going to say, they know who he's thinking about. But we all know it would be about Beth. That's the only person he came anywhere close to that with. She's the only one who ever showed him her shoulder. Okay, it's the only thing that could really be. Then we get into the next episode, the next scene, where he sleeps next to Isabel. I know there are certain people that are going to freak out about this scene. It's actually a very strong callback to Consumed, where he laid down next to Carol and slept next to her. And that shows right there, as if everything else hadn't already, that there's not going to be a romance between him and Isabel, because she's very much taking the place of Carol. And remember that originally Melissa McBride was going to be in the spinoff, and she backed out for the first season. So they needed to have a character that was going to take her place, and that is Isabel. Okay. And I think that's why they do parallel scenes like this, to show that she is kind of a stand-in for Carol right now. He offered to sleep on the floor, and she said that was okay, that was okay. He didn't need to. But the other thing that kind of struck me when I was watching it is that she's not anywhere near that either. You just didn't feel any romantic tension at all in this scene. And as soon as she lays down, she starts asking him about lying to, the people at the school about being able to help Madame Dubois, who was their teacher, she's the old lady that's sick in the bed. And she immediately says, how do you know medicine will help her? And he says it won't. She's going to die anyway, but we need to get that horse. So her mind is on other things, okay? She's not thinking about anything romantic here. And I know we all know that, but it jumped out at me that they did that purposely. But then Daryl says something that is both really compelling and really heartbreaking here. Isabel mentions that she feels bad for the kids because they don't remember what it was like in the old world before the turn. And then Daryl says, you can't miss what you didn't have. Or what you never had, I think is what he said. But he's not talking about the kids in the old world. He's thinking about the fact that he's never had a true romance with anyone. So it's just a carryover from the previous scene. He's watching the romantic comedy about Mork and Mindy. He starts thinking about the fact that he never had that, or that's kind of the way he's framing it. And then in the next scene, he says, you can't miss what you never had. It's so sad and it's so heartbreaking. But the thing that I want to call your attention to about that is that when people say you can't miss what you never had, I've seen that line used other places in other stories and things. It's always a load of crap, okay? Because they're thinking they never had something, but they really did, or at least they thought they did emotionally, even if it never really came to fruition. So at least emotionally, he thought he had a relationship with Beth, but then he lost it before it could really bloom into anything. And when he says, you can't miss what you never had, clearly he misses it. That's just not even true at all. Even if it was just the expectation of something, you can still miss it, right? So it's a very sad scene. But I really loved that because I think this gives us a lot of clues, fills in some blanks for us about what some of the characters are thinking and what they're feeling. Like I said, number one, clearly there's a romance coming up for him. They would not put this in if it were not leading somewhere. It's not going to be Isabel. It's not going to be Carol. And another thing that I was thinking about is that I know that there are some people in the fandom who sort of hope that maybe secretly Beth and Daryl might have been sleeping together, or at least had some sort of off-screen kiss, and that it will show us that eventually. But I think this is confirmation. I've never really thought that would be the case, but I've had other people ask me about that. And I think this is confirmation that is not the case. What we saw was as far as their relationship got. Otherwise, I don't think he would talk about never having something. It also shows, though, that he doesn't believe at all that Leah was him having that. That's not, when he thinks about having somebody special and being in love and having a wife, he does not think of Leah as like his lost chance at all. If he did, he was in a relationship with her for a while. And if he's still saying, I've never had that, then obviously, anyway, I just thought that was kind of interesting. So that was a really fun scene, and it really drives home that Beth is coming. Okay, so obviously we loved that. Okay, so in terms of the present day story, there's not a whole lot more that's super relevant. Obviously, they go to the castle and manage to secure the horse. I'm going to talk about that separately here in just a minute. And then they get back on the road again. And the last thing we kind of see is Daryl talking to Laurent. Laurent is being super surly. He doesn't want to be treated like a kid, which is his way of saying he doesn't like Isabel lying to him about things. And he's angry that he didn't get to stay with his friends at the school, but Daryl talks to him, and they are just continuing on their way north in the next leg of their journey. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next one, and I apologize if you guys are hearing kind of a weird squeaking noise in the background. My stepmom's dog is playing with her squeaky toy just right outside my door. She's being kind of loud about it, so that's what that is. Let's next quickly go to Isabel's flashbacks to when Laurent was born. I don't have a ton to say about this, but it was really, really interesting. We see that Isabel was somebody who partied a lot. She did drugs, but she was also a pickpocket, which is interesting. It seems to be that that's how she was supporting herself and her sister. She does seem to live a pretty lavish lifestyle. She has what looks like a pretty nice place to live and nice clothing and everything, but she's stealing from people, from really high-end people. Some interesting symbols we saw were she grabbed a couple of watches. We had a hard time telling what times they said, so maybe the time was irrelevant, but any kind of clock, even if it's a watch, tends to be a callback to still. Of course, she starts to see people turn. There are some important symbols that I don't need to go into. I mean, the train is an important symbol, and she saw people on the subway. Then her boyfriend, Quinn, comes and picks her up and takes her home to her sister, who, as it turns out, is pregnant, and she didn't know anything about this. So I was looking up names and symbolism and things like that. Lily, the name Lily means pure one or innocence. So I do feel like they're almost symbolically setting this up as some sort of miraculous conception. And not that that's literally the case in the show, but just they have kind of the symbolism around that. I noticed that Isabel asked her sister who the father was, and Lily never answered. But there's a sister vibe, and they're taking care of each other. So, I mean, it definitely calls back to, Maggie and Beth. I thought of Gamma and her sister, who also had a baby that she was not able to raise. And then W.D. Way reminded me of Andrea and Amy. We have like the younger sister who's a little bit weaker, who ends up dying. I mean, we've kind of seen this over and over again. So it's a common template, at least in the show. They do end up at the Abbey. Oh, actually, before that, we see her abandon her boyfriend, Quinn. Now, keep in mind that we did not see him die, so chances are he will come back into the story at some point. That's just what we know to be true of The Walking Dead. And again, there were some interesting symbols. There was a gas station they were at. Gas is always, gas and gas cans. We've seen that as a symbol a lot, even since the pilot, when Rick went to a gas station. But anyway, they end up at the Abbey. We see Father Jean before he was a walker. We see the Mother Superior who died in the last episode. And Lily gives birth. And we also learn why Isabel thinks he could be the Messiah. And it's because Lily didn't just die in childbirth or from complications of childbirth. She actually died from the virus, from a bite, and turned before they got the baby out. Now, Father Jean performed a cesarean and got him out, but even so, it is really miraculous that he was not exposed to the virus, at least to the extent to make him turn. Because from what we know, in order for someone to reanimate, the blood has to completely circulate in their system, which means the virus would be all throughout their body. And, the baby and the mother are connected through the umbilical cord, so you would think Laurent would have been exposed to it, but whatever the case, he obviously didn't die and didn't turn. So that's why people are saying he's a miracle baby, he's special. And I do wonder if this will factor into the bite cure theory at all, if he has any kind of immunity in his blood or anything because of that. Could be. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. But in the end, Isabel ends up taking care of him, and she is his aunt, which actually, by the way, W.D. totally called. She thought that Isabel was Laurent's aunt and maybe that he belonged to her sister, and she was 100% right about that. She totally called that one. In case you're interested, I did look up a little bit on Saint Laurent, who she names him after. If you want information on who this saint was, you're actually looking for Saint Lawrence. Laurent is the French equivalent of Lawrence. And he was a saint who lived in the Middle Ages, who was Catholic, obviously, and was martyred for his faith. And so that's where his sainthood comes from, and she named him after Laurent. There are some interesting things in that story that might have been the reason that they used it. In looking for this, there actually is a French designer that designed a kind of high-end lines of clothing and bags in the 60s who was named Saint Laurent. And I don't know if that at all went into the writers choosing this name, but it was just something I found in my research. So that was kind of interesting. I thought it was a great backstory. I thought we got a lot of insight into Isabelle and into Laurent as well. But I don't have a whole lot more to say about that. Oh, except I did notice that Isabelle already had her scars before the turn happened. So that's one way in which she's different from Beth. Beth didn't get her scars until after the virus struck, in season 2. But Isabelle already had hers before everyone started turning into walkers. So just a detail that I noticed.